spending money wisely and at the right time is actually the way in which we will minimize the cost of maintaining and improving our aging infrastructure.
Welcome to Calling All Stations, the Transport Podcast. I'm Christian Walmer, an author and journalist who has covered transport for the past 30 years. In every episode, we try to keep you up to date with the most engaging news stories, policy developments, and interviews in the transport world. And with me is my regular co-presenter, Mark Walker, who has spent decades looking at transport policies and legislation. So, Mark, for the last podcast of the year, what are we covering today?
Hello, Christian, and hello to our listeners. For this festive edition of Calling All Stations, first of all, we'll be taking a look back at 2025 and some of the big transport stories that we covered. At the end of the episode, we'll also be looking to the future and what 2026 might bring. But in between, you have an interview with Steve Denton, who's the Vice President of the Royal Academy of Engineering, who's talking about a recent report on Britain's ageing infrastructure and what needs to be done about it.
Right, and that's very apposite because there was actually a bridge collapse in Scotland. Unfortunately, it was an unused bridge. It was an old railway bridge, but it actually collapsed into the Spey River. Rather kind of spectacular.
Terrifying.
Yes, I mean, the pictures are terrifying. I mean, if anybody had been on the bridge or underneath it, they wouldn't be with us today. So it's very apt that we could talk about aging infrastructure. But let's just have a quick look at this year, which I must say has kept us busy, Mark. Not least, we had a great celebration, the Railways 200. Now, I've always thought this is a bit of a con, as you know, because the Stockton and Darlington wasn't really the first railway. In 5 years' time, we're going to repeat the episode with the Liverpool and Manchester 200. And hopefully I'll publish a book or two as well around that, as I have this year. But, this was a fantastic success. I think it got the railways on the map. There was a bit of shortage for funds for it, but then I think the industry did get behind it. There was a great gathering in Derby in early August, which I was at, and it was full, and they had to kind of extend it and get more visitors. And I was very struck with the number of families there and the general interest in railways and young and old. A great event, and shows that there's real potential for this. And there was a train going around Britain with Rail 200 and people dropping in. And there was quite a nice display on the train. So a great success, I think.
Yes, I think so. And a chance for us to wonder at the achievements of the railways over the last 2 centuries and the huge contribution that they make to our society and economy. And of course, we were reminded at the end of the year with the incident at Huntingdon of the important contribution that skilled railway personnel make to the safety and operation of the railways day in and day out.
No, absolutely. And there was another incident in the same week when it was the derailment in Cumbria. And amazingly, the train stayed upright. And again, the staff dealt with it very quickly and nobody was seriously injured and so on. So, yes, very important that we have the skilled staff. Now, of course, the big event was the railways legislation. And you've been following that very closely.
Yes, of course. And we've covered that in detail in an earlier episode. So at last in 2025, we saw the introduction of a railways bill to reform the railways industry's structure, long promised, of course, under the Conservatives and eventually introduced by
2018 government.
Yes, it's been a long march. In fact, perhaps we'll have ceremonies to commemorate that process at some point in the future. But the railways bill has been introduced since we covered in detail its provisions in a recent episode. It's now had its second reading in the House of Commons, so the principle has been agreed by Parliament, and it'll be undergoing detailed scrutiny by the Public Bill Committee, but also in parallel. Let's do everything in parallel and twice. There's an investigation by the House of Commons Transport Committee.
Yes, that's rather strange, isn't it? Aren't they duplicating the work?
It is kind of unusual for a current bill to be analysed in this way by a select committee at the same time. But I think it's a reflection of the level of interest in the subject. And the select committee has had a huge number of submissions. Written submissions, and is also having they've had 3 now, and there will be a 4th evidence session in person to make recommendations to the government and to Parliament more generally about particular aspects of the bill. So I think it reflects in a way the significance of this, as you say, Christian, after a very long gestation period.
Okay, we've also had changes to rules around buses this year.
Yes, so in local transport, we've seen the passing of the Bus Services Act for England during the course of 2025, which puts on a further stronger statutory footing the move towards bus franchising in English cities and regions, and strengthens the powers of mayors and local authorities. In parallel with that, of course, there was also quite a positive funding settlement for local transport, at least in the city regions of England, in the spending review in the summer. So, of course, what we need to see now is action to turn that promised funding into noticeable improvements for users in reality and in those localities.
I mean, it is rather odd that there's legislation to stimulate bus franchising just as the franchising on the railways has kind of been ended, isn't it?
This is a contradiction which is pointed out, of course, by the opposition parties, but each of them in a way represents a step towards a greater level of public or state control, full state control in the case of the railways, and a more of a hybrid model when it comes to buses.
Yeah.
Though, of course, local authorities are being empowered to set up their own bus companies. There are a few that remain
That survived very
privatisation ways and Cardiff and so on, but Lothian. But in England, there's legislation to encourage them to set up their own companies, which could be bidding for those contracts in the future.
And the franchising is a bit different, isn't it? Because it's not about collection of revenue. I mean, the franchising on the railways, the private companies got the money, whereas I think in the bus franchising,
generally the model is that the public sector takes the
more a management contract.
Absolutely, more analogous to the London buses model, where of course people often don't realise that London buses are operated by private companies, but under a regime where they all appear to be part of. They're all rounded. They're all red and all operate the same ticketing system and obviously under timetables set up by Transport for London.
You mentioned London there, and of course, we mention London a lot on this podcast, although we definitely try hard not to be London-centric, but London is a very interesting place from a transport point of view. And one of the things that has changed recently in London is that Sadiq Khan has decided to start charging electric cars for using the congestion zone, for going into the congestion zone. Before this, they were completely free, and now they're going to have to pay not quite as much as other cars, but nevertheless. And that represents, I think, a big change, doesn't it, Mark? Because as you get more and more electric cars, they're going to have to find a way of taxing them because they don't pay fuel tax, and so far they haven't paid the congestion zone.
Yes, and as we covered in our budget feature last month, the Chancellor is consulting on a mechanism for charging for mileage, effectively, to recover from electric vehicle users some contribution towards the tax base of the country and the costs of the road network. So this is an issue where the kind of innovation, the tax regime, the tax man, if you like, has caught up with the innovation and environmental benefits of electric vehicles.
Slowly, a bit belatedly.
And
but
that
yes.
said, you've now got to pay your share.
Right. And while also sort of in London, but also across the country, cycling, again, another of my obsessions. London now has 1.5 million cycle journeys a day. That's given, in the context, the tube has 3.5 million. So it's almost half the number of people crowding onto the tube jump on a bicycle. And this is partly because of Lime bikes, the dockless bikes that are literally littering the town, which is quite a controversial issue because some councils are really getting cross about the number lying around, and pedestrians have complained about it. And really, we need some sort of all London policy and proper regulation of this. But they're not going to go away. I mean, I think, we're seeing them in lots of other towns and cities. They're going to spread. It's a very convenient way of getting around for people. It's part of the future transport mix, don't you think?
Well, as in so many respects, London's transport policy can often be the trendsetter for the rest of the country. And I can't be London-centric because I don't live in London and I'm a visitor to London. But I am a visitor to London. One of the things I'm struck by as a user of the public transport system and as a pedestrian is the huge number of cycles that are on the road, sometimes on the pavement nowadays.
Not always behaving perfectly,
as well, and the huge number of or the range of different bike hire schemes that there are, as well as, of course, the sort of innovative part of the personal transport market, the scooters. And so on, some of which are operating under licensed schemes, but some of which are operating on the basis that people got from a mail order catalogue and, ride around sometimes with a pal on them totally irresponsibly. And you don't just see that in London, you see that in other cities as well. And I think that, perhaps one of the failures of 2025 is that the UK government, anyway, so far has refused to really address the legislative arrangements covering these the way in which road space is used nowadays,
right?
And that hopefully, when we come to look to the future, that's something that should be addressed.
Well, so just to sum up, Mark, how do you think that Labour has done in its first full year of being in power in terms of transport?
God, that's a big question, Christian. I think you could say that they've delivered on the manifesto commitments in relation to rail reform and the progressive return of passenger transport operations to public ownership, and introducing a bill for bus at Great British Railways, as well as the bus legislation, all of which was promised in the manifesto. I think what we'd have to say, though, is that there are certain things that we wouldn't have expected to see in Labour's transport programme. And those are things which are, shall we say, more environmentally questionable. So the headlong growth of civil aviation, for example, which seems to run counter to the net zero emission, but on which Labour was elected, and associated with that, an adoption of road building and road expansion projects. Yes, they've cancelled a number of major highway schemes,
Stonehenge
very early on, and some others as well. But major projects like the A66 dualling have been allowed to go ahead. And of course, as we've covered a couple of times, the Lower Thames Crossing, which is a gigantic motorway in the southeast of England, which was certainly not a manifesto pledge, and certainly operating it or the private sector building and operating it was not a manifesto pledge. And you mentioned it's inherent, in a sense, contradiction, or to some degree, between having non-franchised railways but franchised buses, but then, of course, to privatize a huge piece of public infrastructure the Lower Thames crossing certainly seems to run contrary to that.
Well, there's another contradiction that happened only this week where they franchised out the London Overground. Well, they've given a management contract to a private operator, First Group, for the London Overground services.
Well, indeed, and that's a product of devolution, which is also a big theme of this government and something that they've promoted further in 2025, because London Overground is not under the control of central government, it's under the control of the mayor.
Even though it runs on the National Rail.
It runs on the national network, and he's a Labour mayor.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, the mayor decided to proceed with continuing private sector operation of the Overground, as indeed previously was done with the Elizabeth line, which was also relet to the private sector. So yes, there are, nothing is ever simple, is it?
Right. I would sum up. I mean, by the first year of transport policy as confused. It's impossible for us to discern a kind of overall strategy because of these contradictions, and we'll look to the future later.
We often discuss the poor state of infrastructure, and in particular transport infrastructure in the United Kingdom. This issue was picked up in a report published in December 2025 by the National Engineering Policy Centre, led by the Royal Academy of Engineering, entitled Reviving Our Ageing Infrastructure. Christian's been talking to Steve Denton, who's the Vice President of the Royal Academy of Engineering, about this report, what it tells us, and what actions need to be taken.
I'm with Steve Denton, who is one of the authors of a report on Britain's aging infrastructure and how it needs to be sorted out. The report is been produced by the Royal Academy of Engineering. And so I wonder, Steve, first of all, what prompted the Academy to take an interest in this, and why now?
Christian, thank you. Look, and firstly, thank you very much for the invitation to talk to you this morning. It's really good to be here. I think there are a number of reasons why we wanted to focus on this issue, and partly it was seeing the elevated levels of public concern. But also, I think, really importantly, recognizing that the role that engineers have in looking after our aging infrastructure, and also just being mindful of the level of concern, I guess, we saw in individuals and organizations that have responsibility for looking after our existing infrastructure. And I guess those factors came together, coupled with a recognition that the challenges for our aging infrastructure were growing, and that was, if you like, the stimulus. And then we've spent the last couple of years working in this field, and working hard in this field has really exposed, ratified those concerns, but also exposed a number of issues that reinforced why it's so important that we're talking about this.
And incidentally, yes, I mean, we're talking in a week where we just heard that, a bridge over a river that had an old railway bridge, but it was being used as a cycle path, collapsed into the river. I presume that's the sort of example we're talking about.
Oh, absolutely. And it's just, it's so tremendously sad when we see these things happen. I, looked at the videos of that, glorious old structure that isn't there anymore. And, and from an engineering perspective and a heritage perspective, that's very sad. But in many ways, much more importantly, that means that amenity that people had, the ability to use that bridge, which I understand was as you say, as a walking route, a pedestrian bridge, and a cycle route, that's lost. And that's
I think it was in the northeast, wasn't it?
Scotland, I think.
Oh, Scotland, right. And you highlight in your report some specific examples from across the kind of field of engineering, don't you?
We do. There's a number of bridge examples. It's natural when you're talking about aging infrastructure that Hammersmith Bridge is often on people's minds because it's been so disruptive to people in London. But of course, these challenges extend across the whole country. So Newton Viaduct on the rail network, that needed
That
to
was
be put
between Didcot and Oxford, wasn't it? Yeah.
right, and very, very disruptive. Network Rail had already sort of mobilized the team and contractor was on site to do works to the structure, but an extreme weather event accelerated its deterioration, and that led to the need to close the structure for a period. And Christian, as you'll know very well, that was significantly disruptive. Another noteworthy case that we talk about is Clifton Bridge on the outskirts of Nottingham. Again, it was an inspection. National Highways doing exactly the right things to look after and keep an eye on their structures. Found a concern on that structure, needed to temporarily close it, and the effect of closing that structure was to generate, I think, what at the time was reported as being the most disrupted part of the road network anywhere in Europe.
Yes, that was a concrete structure around Nottingham, wasn't it? A kind of bypass. And once you had the bypass closed, then people had to go through the town centre stuff, didn't they?
I think that's right. I mean, and I think it's again, it's just to bring home the fact that I guess as an engineer, one thinks about the assets, one thinks about the bridges or the tunnels or the embankments, but of course, what really matters is what they're there for. And when if you have to weight restrict a bridge or temporarily close something or speed restrict a part of the rail network, then of course the implications of that are significant, and it affects people's lives and it affects people's livelihoods.
So why do you think we've got into this state? And are you not worried this is just an exaggeration? Look, sometimes bad things happen, and that's just kind of fairly random, and we haven't had major disasters out of any of this. We've just had some mishaps. Are you not exaggerating the scale of what's gone wrong?
I don't think so. I don't think it, and of course it's a very, very legitimate question. Are these isolated incidents or are they part of a pattern?
Yeah.
And looking across many cases, and I guess bringing some of my personal professional experiences to bear, I think what we're seeing is an emerging pattern, and it's a pattern that we need to be concerned about. And there are a number of factors that are coming together here. One is when we look at the age profile of a lot of our critical infrastructure. It is getting older, but it's getting to an age, and again, as you'll understand, when things age, they inevitably deteriorate, but that deterioration is non-linear, and things reach a point where they start to deteriorate.
In other words, just to put it in lay people's language, in other words, it starts off kind of steady and then kind of goes much faster.
Exactly. I mean, it's the point that it's just that rate of deterioration is not static; it accelerates. And as things get older, there is the risk that the rate of deterioration will accelerate unless maintenance is done really, really effectively and renewals are undertaken when they need to be undertaken. And so when we look at the age profile across, and just to say, this report focuses on water, wastewater, flood defenses, and transport, road and rail. Those are the 5 areas that we focused on this report. And you look across the asset portfolios within those sectors, and there are a significant number of assets which are approaching an age where there is a real risk of acceleration of decline. So that's one thing, and that's not something that you can kind of point the finger at and say that's someone's fault. I mean, that's just history. We built a lot of these systems, networks during concentrated periods of time when a lot of things were built at similar time, which means that they age at a similar time, and so we end up with.
That's true. We built the railway network in periods, the railway manias of the 40s and the 60s in the 19th century. And then, of course, we built much of the motorway network in the 60s and 70s of the last century. So, yes, I can see that there's kind of concentrated bits of building require concentrated bits of refurbishment.
I mean, that's one factor.
Yeah.
The other factor, for which the evidence, I think, is very strong, is just the effect of much more frequent extreme weather events.
Climate change. Interesting enough, just before coming onto this, I was interviewed by a woman for the BBC who is doing a report on precisely, why are there more delays on the railways because of climate change? Why is there more effect on it? So, it's very apt. You should discuss that. But what are the? I mean, she was quite interesting that she said, "What are the effects? Why does it matter? So it rains a bit more. Does this matter?"
I mean, the thing which is probably most apparent is when we see flood events, and of course what we also know is that our different infrastructure systems, our water system, our transport systems are really quite interdependent, and they can affect one another. And if we have flooding, then that very often affects our roads and railways as well. So that's one immediate point. And as someone who lives in Bristol and travels by train all the time up to London and up to Birmingham, particularly traveling from Bristol to London, I know that whenever there's a heavy rainfall event, there's always a risk that the trains will be disrupted. And so that's one point. But also if we take the earthworks, and the rail network has over 190,000 cuttings, embankments, many over 150 years old. When the climatic conditions change, the stability of those cuttings and embankments can be affected. And so you get a heightened risk around there being some ground movements. And to mitigate that risk, one needs to monitor, but also, there are, again, quite a lot of locations where, in order to make sure that things remain safe, and that's, of course, the number one priority, that speed restrictions are put in place, and inevitably that has knock-on consequences in terms of disruption.
Okay, I mean, I don't want to be dramatic about this, but and you shy away from it in the report, but are you worried that there might be some major kind of accident out of this?
I think what we're seeing is heightened levels of risk, and I think that if we look at it through a domestic UK lens, then I think there are good regimes in place to try and control things so that those risks don't manifest themselves. But actually, if we look at it globally, we know that there's been, catastrophic events around the world where major bridges have collapsed, other things have happened. So, there is no, I think one has to be very, very careful not to be complacent about these things. And I do think that when we think around our aging infrastructure, certainly just as people that use it just every day, we rely upon our infrastructure. It's very, very easy to take these things for granted.
We've we've had a narrow miss only last month where we had a train derailed near the Lake District, and it was on a straight bit of track, so it stayed upright. But if it had been on a curve, I could imagine it would have toppled over, and then might have caused injuries. And we've also just had huge flooding where my sister-in-law lives in Monmouth, and she's a councillor there, and she's still kind of working on clearing up the mess and dealing with the bridges and whatever. So I mean, I can see this point that it is it is something we have to deal with. So okay, so how do we have to deal? And I mean, I asked you at the press conference, is this just about money? And are you not just is this not a plea for money for more engineering?
Well, and I think my response to you when you asked me that question was that I think, given the aging profile of the assets, and given the pressures of climate change, and given the heightened expectations and reliance we place upon these networks, I think it is inevitable that we're going to need to spend more money on them than we have done recently. However, the focus of the work that we've done, the purpose of this report, was not to talk too much to the, if you like, the absolute sums of money that are necessary, but to really focus on what can we do to make sure that we're spending that money as wisely as possible. Because
yes, the report is good on that. Yes, it does focus on that.
Well, because I think,
and what does that mean?
Well, firstly, set in context, I think it's, we have to be very, very cognizant that every pound that is spent on maintaining our infrastructure is a pound that isn't spent on hospitals, on social care,
Yeah.
on schools, on all of those other really important priorities. So we need to make sure that money is spent wisely. And I think that, I guess the way that I tend to look at this is that the question that you need to answer when you're managing an existing piece of infrastructure, an existing bridge, a tunnel, road, railway, you've broadly got to answer two questions. The first question is, what intervention should I make? What action should I take? And the second question you've got to answer is, when's the optimum time to do it? And those feel like terribly simple questions. And of course, in reality, the simple questions rarely have really simple answers. But those are the essence of the question. What should I do? And when should I do it? And when you start to kind of unpick that, then I think you start to see where there are some real opportunities that become apparent. And if I focus just in that space around innovation and data, for example, so we have 7 areas where we believe that change should be made.
Yeah.
And one of those is about data, and one of those is around innovation. But I think in terms of data, we've got a very long history and established practices in terms of inspecting structures, for example. But the information that we tend to gather from the way in which we've done inspections historically is very good at telling us whether that bridge, for example, that embankment is in reasonable condition at that point in time. But it tends not to be very good at understanding what's changing. It's
Right.
very hard. You go out and then you inspect, you go out and inspect the bridge, probably be inspecting it at night. You'll take some photographs, but then if someone goes back, different person, probably a couple of years later, and you look at the same structure, how can you tell what's changed? And it isn't straightforward. And yet, when you think about those two questions that I introduced, that second question is all about timing. It's a when question. When should I do it? And so really understanding the rate at which things are changing is absolutely fundamental to answering that second question effectively. And there are a host of new digital tools, digital technologies, innovations I think we can bring in that can really help us to answer those questions better.
Oh, that's a very good and positive answer. Another one of your 7 lists, which I did make a note of, was public awareness, and presumably this report is about that. What are you now doing with this, and are you knocking on the doors of some government departments and saying, "Hey, look, we've done this report. What is your response?"
Yeah, we're certainly doing that. In fact, we launched the report just last week in the Houses of Parliament, and we've had a very, very good reaction to the report. And I think and there are, as you know, a number of recommendations that are directed towards government. But around the point of societal awareness, I think our recommendations are broader than that, because we think that everyone who is involved in this area needs to be part of trying to create a new narrative. We need to be talking about this in the right terms, in the right way, so that hopefully there can be a slightly different conversation, that we can move away from that risk that is true of all of us, that we take things for granted, but actually, foster a different narrative where maintenance and renewal and enhancement of existing structures of existing infrastructure is valued, and that the trade-off between them can be discussed.
Yes, I mean, this is the point to end on, which I was impressed with, as you said in the report, that a pound that is spent now might save £5 or £10 later. The trouble is, the governments are not very good at that, and I presume that's a message you're trying to get across.
It certainly is a message that we're trying to get across. As you correctly point out, it turns out, as we all sort of heard when we were kids, that a stitch in time really can save 9. But the way that I tend to try and talk about this is that you'll know in the sector, sometimes you hear people talking about maintenance holidays, and because they're talking about holidays, it sounds like a good thing,
Yes.
But the reality here is that, a maintenance holiday, I mean, essentially the cost of that, we are putting on the national credit card. And ultimately, as with any credit card bill, you have to pay it, and you have to pay it with interest. And so spending money wisely and at the right time is actually the way in which we will minimize the cost of maintaining and improving our aging infrastructure. I do feel that those people who dedicate their professional lives to looking after our aging infrastructure are undervalued and underappreciated. And we do have skills challenges in these areas. And so it's really important that we talk about it. So I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity to do that today.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. That's a great point to end on. And, you've got across this very well. And let's hope that there's people listening out there.
Christian, the Reviving Our Aging Infrastructure report that you've just been discussing with Steve was very much about looking to the future. What do you hope 2026 might bring to the world of transport?
Well, I think what I hope for and what I expect are probably somewhat different, but, look, it's going to be a busy year. There's the railways bill for a start, which, we still are somewhat uncertain about precisely how this will work and how the Great British Railways will be structured and so on. And so by the time we do this report next year to sum up the year, I think we will have a good idea of what the railways are now going to look like for the future, which we still are a bit confused about. And of course, the other aspect of railways, before going on to other subjects, is HS2. And really, we're waiting for this reset, which is promised, but I think February, where they're going to take a long, deep, well, they have taken a long, deep look at the project, and they're going to set out, what is feasible, when it might likely to be finished. Now, on the past, Mark Wilde, who is actually now in charge of it, was in charge of Crossrail when it needed sorted out after the 2018 kind of collapse in the project, and he was very careful over Crossrail not to give a specific end date, and I somewhat suspect that will be the case. But I won't put my life on it, but I very much expect there'll be no railway operating on the line until 2036 at the earliest. But
now, related to HS2, Christian, you've gone into print on the state of Euston as well, haven't you?
Absolutely, and that's a really big story, because I wrote a column in Rail magazine about this, open letter to Keir Starmer. And Euston is this mega project which I don't think people understand, because it's like 5 projects in one. It's kind of involves rebuilding the tube station, building the mainline station, building the HS2 station, and then having a new bus and taxiway to it, all of which has, the first thing they have to do is an enormous job of moving utilities, which is a really very expensive and major thing, because they can't expand the tube station without that. So this is a project that is going to go on for 10 or 15 years, and they've got to kickstart it now. They've got to start giving us a blueprint of what it's going to look like. And apparently the tunnel boring machines are going to start wending their way from Old Oak Common towards Euston at the beginning of 2026. So let's see how that goes. But there's enormous confusion about it, as there is with Northern Powerhouse Rail as well, which we've covered in this podcast.
Yes, indeed. So, with local elections coming up in England, one might expect that Northern Powerhouse Rail and other big transport schemes could feature in the political landscape. But of course, we've had some news from West Yorkshire just before you and I sat down to record this podcast.
And apparently they've kicked the sort of tram scheme in West Yorkshire further into touch by saying, oh, well, it's not ready, we need a business case and all that. And my view is that this is just a way of delaying things. And this Labour government needs to show some results by the time it goes to the polls again in 2029. And this is the sort of thing where it could be saying, we're building this, it's happening and whatever. And instead they're kicking it into touch over, we need a business case and so on. And, in Spain, as I've written in my forthcoming book, to be published in July, fast track. In Spain, they just said, we're going to build a high-speed network. And they did it, and they did it in kind of 25 years, and they didn't have a detailed business case for every bit of it. They just said, we're going to do this. This is a national project, and we should be doing that sort of thing for these major urban schemes, which are absolutely necessary. And, doing the business case is just money for the consultants.
Now, when it comes to the political landscape in 2026, as well as local elections in England, we have the very important all-out elections for the Scottish Parliament at Holyrood and the Senedd in Cardiff, the Welsh Parliament. So, and in each case, transport is one of the major devolved powers. In fact, for Wales in 2025, we had 2 episodes of this podcast that featured transport initiatives and rail projects in Wales. So how do you think those might go?
Well, I'm not sure that Labour, which has done very well on transport in Wales, they managed to get essentially more than £1 billion investment for the what used to be called the Cardiff Valleys lines. They've also got new trains for the whole network. It's kind of buzzing. And yet, at the moment, the latest polls show Labour at 10%, whereas Plaid Cymru at 33% and the Reform at 30%. So it doesn't seem that, these excellent kind of changes will be rewarded at the polls. But, we have to wait and see. And similarly in Scotland, where they effectively, they renationalised it some time ago and kind of brought ScotRail and the services and the Network Rail closer together, and it's kind of been quite successful, and they're spending quite a lot of money on the rail. Again, I'm not sure that Labour are going to get any rewards for that.
One of the big gambles that the government has taken is on its ability to achieve economic growth. And that's not going terribly well so far, but maybe that's that there are other global considerations that are in play there as well, to be fair. But they've decided to double down on civil aviation as one of the ways of achieving growth. And they also think they can get the private sector to pay for the necessary infrastructure. So, of course, in 2026, we'll see the further development of the proposals to expand Heathrow Airport with a third runway, which requires a certain level of legislative process and a certain level, shall we say, of public consultation as well.
Well, and then public money to, who's going to pay for moving the M25 and possibly bringing in new railways into the system and so on. Look, this one is going to last long and a long time into the future, and I'm sure we'll be talking a lot about it. As we will be talking about driverless cars, which, as you know, is one of my obsessions. And in London, we're due to get driverless cars in April or May. They will still have an operator. They won't be entirely driverless. But it will be fascinating to see if Waymo, the Google-owned company which operates them, will be able to fulfill its promise of bringing them in, but also whether what the public reaction to them is, because my view is that the public will be very sceptical about it. But the government is incredibly enthusiastic about this. I only saw one of their ministers, Simon Lightfoot, talking about how disabled people will benefit from driverless cars. Blind people will, be given extra mobility. I have no idea why he thinks that, because at the moment, blind people can take a taxi where there is a driver to help them put their luggage in the boot and so on. And if a driverless car turns up, how on earth will a blind person actually know how to get into the car and where precisely the car is and so on, and not step into the road? It's just a fantasy. And, it drives me insane with the fact that, they just go on about driverless cars as the future and don't think these things out. But anyway, regular listeners will know about this, that I'm slightly obsessed with this subject. And of course, then we've got the electric cars, which we mentioned earlier. Will be very interesting to see how it plays out, how they manage to tax electric car use. Quite difficult to work out how.
So all in all, 2026 looks like a target-rich environment when it comes to subjects for our podcast in the transport field.
I guarantee you one thing, Mark, we will have lots to talk about, and we will bring our listeners up to date with all developments, as we say every time.
And in the meantime, we wish you all a very Merry Christmas and all the best for 2026. Keep listening.
Indeed, Happy New Year for 2026 from both of us.
Here's Christian's final thought from the Departure Lounge.
Well, just a quick call out to all the people who are working in the transport industry at Christmas and New Year, keeping the trains going, the buses going, and ensuring that people get away on their holidays on flights, who have to sacrifice their Christmas and celebrations in order to provide a service. And they don't often get recognised. And indeed, even though the trains aren't running on Christmas Day, there are literally thousands of engineers who are working on the tracks to keep the trains safe for the future. And, that's an annual event, and we ought to give our thanks to them.
Calling All Stations, the Transport Podcast with Christian Walmart, is produced by Cogitamus Limited, a leading provider of public affairs consultancy services in the sector. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please consider giving us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do follow us on social media channels, including Blue Sky, Facebook, and X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle on X is @AllStationsPod.